two brothers vanished in 1968, and 50 years later, deep in the woods outside Maple Falls, a forgotten cabin was discovered that would finally whisper the truth. It was the kind of place no one was supposed to find. Hidden under a canopy of trees, half swallowed by moss and time, the cabin leaned against itself like it had been holding its breath for decades. The roof sagged, the door clung weakly to its hinges. Inside, the air was thick and stale, but it was what had been left behind that chilled everyone who stepped through the threshold. On the floor sat a pair of children's shoes, cracked with age but unmistakably small. Rusted tin cans stacked neatly in the corner. And carved into the wooden wall, two sets of initials, D, M, and M, M. The same initials as the Mitchell boys. The cabin hadn't forgotten them, even if much of the town had. But to understand this discovery, to understand why it shook Maple Falls to its core, we have to go back. Back to the last golden summer of 1968. Back to the Mitchell family, to two inseparable brothers, and to the day they walked down the road and disappeared into legend. It was the kind of summer that lived in snapshots of golden light and barefoot days. The air smelled of cut grass and gasoline, a mix of lawnmowers and the steady hum of pickup trucks passing through. Kids rode their bikes until dusk, their tires crunching over gravel roads, fireflies flickering like little sparks against the deepening sky. The town itself, let's call it Maple Falls, wasn't much more than a cluster of houses, a diner that served bottomless coffee, and a hardware store where half the gossip passed as transactions. A railroad track cut through one end, disappearing into the tree line, and beyond that was the forest, thick, endless, and older than the town itself. The kind of place kids dared each other to enter, but rarely went too far. This was the world of the Mitchell family. The Mitchells weren't wealthy, but they had each other, and in small towns like Maple Falls, that counted for a lot. The father, Thomas, worked long shifts at the paper mill on the edge of town, coming home with sawdust clinging to his boots. Their mother, Evelyn, kept the household together with quiet determination, balancing laundry, church commitments, and the bottomless appetites of three growing kids. The oldest was their daughter, Mary, 14, just beginning to trade dolls for magazines and secret notes passed in class. Then there were the brothers, Daniel, 10, and Michael, 8. Daniel was the ringleader, always with a scraped knee, always chasing after the next adventure, his pockets full of treasures that others would call junk bottle caps, marbles, a coin so worn you could barely read the date. He was protective of Michael, who followed him everywhere like a shadow. Michael was quieter, softer, the kind of boy who noticed things others missed, a bird's nest tucked in the rafters of the barn, the way the sun turned the creek water into gold in the evening. He laughed easily, a sound that could lighten even his father's tired end-of-shift silences. Together, they were inseparable. If you saw one, the other wasn't far behind. Neighbors often said it was like they spoke their own language, half words, half knowing glances. That summer, the Mitchell boys spent their days exploring. Sometimes it was the edges of the woods, daring each other to go deeper. Other times it was the abandoned rail yard where they would balance on tracks and imagine trains to faraway places. They had plans, secret ones, about building a fort, about catching frogs big enough to brag about maybe, just maybe, sneaking into the county fair without paying. Life was ordinary, familiar, and then it wasn't. The week leading up to their disappearance had been hot, the kind of heat that clung even after the sun went down. On the day everything changed, Evelyn remembered making lemonade in the kitchen. She remembered Michael slipping in to steal an extra cookie, his smile guilty but bright. She remembered Daniel asking if they could go, just down the road, just for a while. It was nothing unusual. The boys often wandered the nearby fields, sometimes down by the creek, but that day, that particular afternoon in August, would become a dividing line in the Mitchell family's life. No one knew it then. At supper, their places sat empty, their chairs pulled back but never filled. Dinner grew cold. Evelyn looked out the window every few minutes, expecting to see them racing back up the drive. Thomas tried to stay calm, reasoning that boys could lose track of time. But as darkness fell, reason gave way to dread. Mary remembered her mother's hands shaking as she dialed the phone, calling the neighbors, then the sheriff. She remembered her father's boots pounding down the porch steps as he set off into the night with a flashlight. She remembered the silence that hung in the air, too heavy, too strange. By midnight, the whole town knew. And by dawn, Maple Falls would never be the same. But let's pause here. Before the panic, before the rumors, before the long, cold years of waiting. Imagine them as they were in those final, ordinary days. Daniel, with his pockets jingling from marbles and coins, Michael trailing behind him with his thoughtful quiet. Two boys in the summer of 1968, unaware that they were about to walk straight into a mystery that would haunt a family and a town for half a century. The forest was waiting, and somewhere within its shadows, the cabin waited too. The morning of August 12, 1968, began like so many others in Maple Falls. The cicadas had already started their droning chorus before the sun crested over the trees, promising another day of thick, relentless heat. Evelyn Mitchell woke early, as she always did, the screen door creaking shut behind her as she stepped out to hang the laundry. She remembered the way the damp sheets clung to her arms, the air heavy even at that hour. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle moaned, then faded back into silence. Inside, Daniel and Michael were already restless. They'd wolfed down cereal, barely sitting still long enough to finish, before begging their mother to let them go outside. She tried to hold them off, reminding them that their father would be home for supper and wanted everyone at the table. But Daniel had that stubborn set to his jaw. They wanted one more adventure before school started back in a few weeks. Just down the road, they promised. Just by the creek. Evelyn relented, the way mothers often do when summer is running out and childhood feels too short. She told them to be back before dinner. She told them not to go past Miller's Field, the invisible boundary every parent in town seemed to enforce. And she told them, most of all, to stay together. Daniel grinned, tugged Michael by the arm, and the two of them vanished down the gravel road, their voices echoing faintly behind them. That was the last time Evelyn would see her sons alive. Neighbors remembered seeing the boys that afternoon. Mrs. Lawson, who lived at the corner where the paved road gave way to dirt, said she saw them kicking a can back and forth, laughing, daring each other to walk the rail ties. Old Man Miller, out on his tractor, swore he spotted them near the edge of his field, heading toward the woods. Nobody thought much of it at the time. In a town like Maple Falls, children wandered. They always came home. But as the sun tilted west, a quiet unease began to creep into the Mitchell house. Evelyn set the table at 5. By 5:30, she was pacing between the window and the stove, glancing out into the dimming light. By 6, she had sent Mary down the road to see if maybe her brothers had lingered by the Lawson place. When Mary came back shaking her head, the worry solidified into something sharper. Thomas arrived home just after 6:30, his shirt damp with sweat from the mill. He expected the usual chaos, kids arguing over who got the last biscuit, Evelyn trying to keep the peace, but instead, he found silence. He found his wife at the window, her face pale. He found 2 empty chairs at the table. At first, he brushed it off. Boys were boys, he told her. Maybe they'd gone frog hunting at the creek, maybe they'd just lost track of time. He grabbed a flashlight and set off down the road, calling their names. He checked the creek bank, the abandoned rail yard, even the field where Miller said he'd last seen them. Nothing. By 8 o'clock, the sun was gone, replaced by a thick blanket of night. Crickets chirped in the fields. The trees loomed darker than usual, as if hiding something. When Thomas returned, his boots crunching on the gravel, Evelyn saw the truth in his eyes before he spoke a word. The boys weren't just late, they were gone. The first calls went out then to the sheriff, to neighbors, to anyone who might help. Mary remembered her mother clutching the phone, her voice trembling but insistent, while her father barked orders to the men who gathered on the porch with lanterns and dogs. The whole town seemed to stir awake that night, as if an alarm had been sounded. What none of them could have known was how little the search would uncover, and how deeply the mystery would dig its claws into Maple Falls. By midnight, the gravel roads around the Mitchell home were crawling with headlights. Pickup trucks lined the ditches, men with flashlights fanned out into the woods. Someone brought hounds, their noses to the ground, their barks echoing through the trees. Women gathered in the kitchen, making coffee, whispering prayers, trying to console Evelyn as she sat at the table, her hands wringing a dish towel over and over. Mary, only 14, felt like she was watching the world tilt sideways. Her brothers had been constants in her life, noisy shadows always tugging at her, always underfoot. The idea that they had simply walked away and never returned felt impossible. Yet with each hour that passed, impossibility began to look a lot like reality. The search stretched into the early morning. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies among the trees. The creek was searched twice, then 3 times. Men waded waist-deep into the dark water, feeling with their hands along the muddy bottom. Dogs howled at shadows. The woods gave nothing back. By dawn, Thomas Mitchell returned home with shoulders slumped, his flashlight beam finally gone weak. Evelyn had not moved from the kitchen. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, her lips trembling, and asked the question no parent ever wants to voice. "Where are my boys?" He had no answer. The official search began in full the next morning. Sheriff Harold Jenkins, a broad man with a thinning hairline and a slow drawl, organized volunteers into grids. The local paper ran the story on the front page. TWO, brothers missing, community joins search. Radio stations broadcast descriptions. Daniel, 10 years old, brown hair, green eyes, last seen in a red shirt and jeans. Michael, 8 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, wearing overalls, both barefoot. Every corner of Maple Falls seemed to turn itself inside out in those first frantic days. Farmers put down their tools, shopkeepers closed their stores. Entire families trudged into the woods with canteens and bug spray, calling out the boys' names until their voices cracked. Some swore they heard answering shouts, faint and far away, but when they followed, there was only silence. The woods around Maple Falls weren't endless, but they were dense and confusing. Paths looped back on themselves, streams twisted and disappeared. People got turned around easily, even in daylight. And there was always the feeling that the trees were listening. By the end of that first week, there was still nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no broken branches that might suggest which way the boys had gone. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Whispers began almost immediately. Some people muttered that maybe they'd run away, though no one could explain why 2 boys that young would do such a thing. Others hinted at darker possibilities, that someone passing through town might have lured them away, or that something in the woods had taken them. Through it all, Evelyn clung to hope with a mother's stubbornness. She told anyone who would listen that her boys were alive. She believed it in her bones. She believed she would hear their laughter again, see them running up the road with dirty faces and wild stories about where they'd been. She refused to let go. But Maple Falls was already shifting. What had begun as a frantic community-wide effort slowly turned into something else: tension, suspicion, and fear. And as summer slipped toward autumn, the story of Daniel and Michael Mitchell began to grow colder, darker, and far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. By the time the sun rose over Maple Falls on August 13th, the Mitchell home no longer felt like a home. It had become command central. The screen door never stopped squeaking, people coming and going in waves, the kitchen table buried under maps, half-empty coffee cups, and hastily scribbled notes. The smell of strong coffee and cigarette smoke clung to the curtains. Sheriff Jenkins stood at the center of it all, rubbing his jaw as he tried to make sense of the chaos. He wasn't used to this kind of thing. Maple Falls had its share of petty thefts, the occasional bar fight, maybe a runaway cow that caused a stir down Main Street. Missing children? That was something you read about in the papers from bigger cities. It didn't happen here. But it had. And now everyone was looking to him for answers. He ordered a fresh sweep of the woods, this time with more structure. Men were assigned to grid patterns, volunteers told to stick together in pairs. "No wandering off," he warned. "We don't need more people lost." Women stayed behind at the house, taking shifts to cook, to answer phones, to comfort Evelyn, who had not slept. Evelyn sat in her living room, her Bible open on her lap, though she hadn't read a word. Her eyes kept darting to the window, as if expecting at any moment to see Daniel and Michael strolling up the road with sheepish grins. She whispered prayers under her breath, promises to God that she would never ask for anything again, if only her boys would come home. Mary hovered nearby, old enough to sense the gravity of what was happening but too young to know what to do. She wanted to be useful, but the adults kept pushing her aside, telling her to sit, to rest. All she could do was watch her parents unravel in different ways. Her mother's trembling faith, her father's stubborn determination. Thomas refused to stop moving. He left with the first search parties, his flashlight still tucked in his belt even though daylight blazed through the trees. He called out until his voice turned hoarse, his ears straining for the faintest sound, anything that might be his boys. At one point, he thought he heard laughter. He charged through the brush, branches clawing at his arms, only to find nothing but empty woods and the echo of his own hope breaking. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion began to gnaw at the searchers. The August heat was merciless, sweat soaking through shirts, bugs swarming their necks, but no one wanted to stop. The town seemed to be running on sheer willpower, fueled by fear and adrenaline. Even the hounds panted hard, tongues lolling, but their noses found no fresh trail. That was the first thing that gnawed at Sheriff Jenkins. If the boys had just wandered off, there should have been something. A scent, a footprint, torn fabric on a branch. Kids didn't just vanish. Not without leaving behind a trace. As night fell, lanterns and flashlights once again bobbed through the darkness. The woods felt different at night, more alive, more watchful. Every rustle of leaves sent nerves jangling. Men swore they saw movement in the shadows, but when they turned, there was nothing there. Some whispered that maybe the boys were hiding, playing some sort of game. But even that thought was laced with dread. Why hadn't they come out by now? Back at the Mitchell house, Evelyn refused to lie down. She paced the floorboards until they creaked, jumping every time a car pulled into the drive. Each time, she rushed to the porch, her heart surging with the hope that her boys would step out of the headlights. Each time, it wasn't them. On the second night, tension began to fray at the edges. People were tired, irritable. Some argued about search strategies, whether they should go deeper into the forest or whether they should check the river again. Theories began to spill out, whispered at first, then louder as exhaustion stripped away restraint. Could have been a drifter, one man muttered over his coffee. Plenty passed through on the rail line, you never know. Another countered, they're kids, probably hiding in some old barn, we'll find them. But the longer they searched, the less confident everyone became. By the third day, the Mitchells' house felt like it was suspended in some terrible dream. Breakfast plates sat untouched, the food cold. The phone rang constantly, relatives calling, reporters sniffing around, people offering prayers or outlandish theories. Evelyn barely heard any of it. She sat with the boys' school pictures in her lap, tracing their faces with her thumb, trying to will them back into the room. Thomas grew angrier with each passing hour. Angrier at the sheriff for not having answers. Angrier at the townsfolk for whispering. Angrier at himself for letting the boys go off that day. He replayed it over and over. What if he'd come home early? What if he'd told them no? What if he'd walked with them down the road? Each what if hollowed him out a little more. Mary, left in the cracks between her parents' grief, began to notice things the adults overlooked. The way her father's hands shook when he lit a cigarette. The way her mother's voice cracked when she sang hymns to herself in the kitchen. The way the neighbors avoided eye contact after dark, as though even looking too long might invite the same fate onto their own children. The sheriff called in state troopers by the end of that week. Helicopters buzzed low over the treetops, their blades chopping the air, searchlights scanning the canopy. Reporters from bigger towns started to arrive, their cameras flashing, their questions sharp. The Mitchells found themselves thrust into a spotlight they never wanted, their grief dissected for headlines. But for all the manpower, for all the resources poured into the search, there was still nothing. No trace of Daniel, no trace of Michael. And that was when panic began to transform into something heavier, something colder. By the second week, the town of Maple Falls was no longer united by urgency, but divided by suspicion. Whispers spread like smoke. Maybe the boys hadn't just wandered into the woods. Maybe someone they knew had taken them. The sheriff tried to tamp it down, but once that kind of rumor takes root, it grows fast. People eyed their neighbors differently. Long-forgotten grudges resurfaced. Questions were asked in hushed tones. Who was the last to see them? Who might have wanted to hurt the Mitchells? Was it possible that evil had been living among them all along? Through it all, the Mitchells were caught in the center, a family unraveling under the weight of fear and unanswered questions. Evelyn clung harder to her faith, insisting her boys were alive somewhere. Thomas grew quieter, retreating into himself, his anger now simmering like an untended fire. Mary stopped speaking in class, stopped going to the diner with friends. She learned, at just 14, what it felt like to become a ghost while still alive. The first hours of panic had passed, but something far worse had taken their place. The boys were gone, and Maple Falls would never again feel like the safe little town it had been on that bright August morning. The first week bled into the second, and still the boys did not come home. What began as a frantic search soon turned into something more methodical, more desperate, and more unsettling with each passing day. At dawn, Trucks lined the dirt road leading to the Mitchells' house. Men climbed out with canteens slung over their shoulders, carrying rifles slung casually across their backs, not because they were hunting, but because the woods in Maple Falls were thick with wildlife. And fear made people cautious. Women packed sandwiches in wax paper and stacked thermoses of coffee by the porch. Teenagers, too young to truly understand what had happened, but old enough to crave purpose, volunteered to comb the woods alongside their fathers. Sheriff Jenkins tried to keep it organized. He stood by the hood of his cruiser, maps spread across the metal, assigning groups to different sections of land. They scoured Miller's fields, the creek banks, the old quarry that had been abandoned for decades. When one group returned empty-handed, another would head out again. The rhythm became familiar. March into the woods with hope, stumble out hours later with nothing but silence. The woods became the enemy. They loomed at the edge of every field, thick and shadowed, swallowing voices. During the day, they seemed endless. At night, they seemed alive. Men who had hunted in those woods their whole lives admitted they felt uneasy, as though something was watching them from behind the trees. A few refused to go back in after dark. "You can't see the ground for the brush," one muttered. "Could be anything out there. Anyone." Rumors began to take root. The first were whispers of a drifter. Maple Falls sat on a rail line, and every so often a stranger would pass through someone, hopping trains, looking for work, or just passing the time. Folks began to recall unfamiliar faces they'd seen in town that summer. A tall man who asked for water at the diner. A stranger seen near the depot. Each memory grew sharper in hindsight, sharper with fear. But others insisted it wasn't a stranger. They leaned closer over their coffee cups and lowered their voices. Sometimes the danger came from people you knew. The Mitchell family tried to hold steady against the growing tide of speculation. Evelyn kept praying, her voice hoarse from repeating the same words over and over. Thomas grew restless, pacing, always volunteering for another search shift, always pushing himself deeper into the woods. Mary listened to the adults whisper when they thought she was asleep. Words like kidnapped, words like gone, words no child should hear. The sheriff brought in bloodhounds again, determined to find something. He handed the boys' clothes to the handlers, watched the dogs sniff and whine. For a moment, it looked promising. The hounds tugged hard toward the tree line, their noses low to the ground. But not a mile in, they lost the scent. The handlers shook their heads. It was as if the trail had evaporated. That detail struck everyone. If the boys had walked into the woods, there should have been a path to follow. Even if they had been carried, there should have been a trace. But the dogs found nothing. The forest was too clean, too empty. Theories spiraled. Some insisted the boys had drowned in the creek, swept downstream. But the water was shallow that summer, barely knee-deep in places. Searchers scoured every bend and pool, dragged hooks along the bottom, but found nothing. Others muttered about abandoned wells or sinkholes, places where the earth could swallow children whole. Old maps were pulled out, and men checked every hollow they could find. Still nothing. Then came the wilder whispers. Some spoke of cult activity. The 60s had brought strange headlines, rumors of communes, of people turning to darker rituals in hidden places. To some in Maple Falls, the woods seemed like the perfect stage for such things. Others brought up UFOs, pointing to strange lights folks claimed to have seen in the sky that summer. It sounded ridiculous, even to those who said it, but when two boys disappear without a trace, people reach for explanations beyond reason. The sheriff dismissed the wilder theories, but he couldn't stop the talk. Every day that passed without answers made the town more restless, more suspicious. People began locking their doors at night, something most had never bothered with before. Mothers kept their children close, warning them not to stray past the yard. The carefree days of summer were gone, replaced by curfews and fear. Reporters fanned the flames. They camped outside the diner, pestered the sheriff, cornered townsfolk for quotes. Their headlines grew more dramatic with each edition. Brothers vanish without a trace. Mystery haunts, small town. Maple Falls, once an anonymous dot on the map, was now under a magnifying glass. Outsiders speculated with the same casual cruelty that the townsfolk whispered with in private. For the Mitchells, the pressure was unbearable. Evelyn found herself fielding questions from strangers who spoke of her sons as though they were characters in a story instead of flesh and blood. Thomas lashed out at the press more than once, his grief boiling into rage. Mary shrank further into herself, feeling the weight of everyone's stares at school, the way classmates whispered when she walked past. One evening, about 2 weeks into the search, a group of volunteers returned from the woods pale and shaken. They claimed they'd found something strange, a clearing with crude symbols carved into trees, arranged in circles. Some swore it was evidence of witchcraft. Others thought it was just the work of teenagers trying to stir panic. The sheriff inspected the site himself, but nothing tied it to the missing boys. Still, the rumor spread, feeding the town's unease. Another night, a man stumbled into the sheriff's office claiming he'd seen 2 boys matching the Mitchell brothers' description near the train yard in a town 20 miles away. The sheriff drove out with deputies, combed through the tracks and warehouses, but the tip led nowhere. False leads piled up, each one raising hope, then crushing it, each one deepening the family's despair. Evelyn began to light a candle in the window every night. It was a small flame, flickering against the dark, a signal to her boys if they were out there that home was waiting. Some nights she sat in the living room and stared at that flame until dawn, whispering her sons' names. Thomas grew thinner, his face hollowed by exhaustion. He kept his boots by the door, ready to search again at the first hint of light. Some nights he didn't come home until morning, wandering the woods with nothing but his flashlight and desperation. Mary learned to slip through the cracks of grief. She kept the house running in small ways, washing dishes, folding clothes, feeding the chickens, while her parents drowned in sorrow. She never said it aloud, but part of her knew she was growing invisible in her own home. All anyone saw were the missing boys. By the end of the 3rd week, the search lost its rhythm. Volunteers began to taper off. People had to return to jobs, to their own families. The sheriff could only stretch his deputies so far. The woods were quieter now, lanterns no longer bobbing through the night. The Mitchells noticed the silence most of all. At first, the house had been full of people, neighbors, friends, even strangers bringing food, offering help, praying in the living room. Now, the crowds were thinning, the phone rang less. The house grew quieter. The absence of noise was almost worse than the chaos. It meant life was moving on, even if theirs had stopped. And somewhere, in the midst of that quiet, something darker began to settle in. If the boys hadn't wandered off, if they hadn't drowned, if no one in the woods had found a trace, then what had really happened to Daniel and Michael Mitchell? By September of 1968, the air in Maple Falls had shifted. The long, heavy summer was loosening its grip, and with it came an edge of unease that no one could shake. The trees along Main Street were beginning to yellow, their leaves brittle at the edges, but for the Mitchell family, the days blended together in an endless gray. The boys were still gone. The questions were still unanswered. The official search had slowed, though Sheriff Jenkins refused to call it off. "We keep looking," he told his deputies, his jaw clenched as though daring anyone to argue. But the truth was obvious. Resources were running thin, and so were nerves. In the absence of answers, whispers grew louder. The first were easy enough to dismiss. A child swore he'd seen Daniel and Michael hiding in an old barn on the outskirts of town. Searchers rushed there only to find nothing but broken boards and the smell of hay. A gas station attendant in the next county swore 2 barefoot boys had come in asking for candy, but when pressed, he admitted he couldn't be sure they could have been anyone's kids. Then came the psychics. The Mitchells received letters from all over the country, strangers who claimed to have visions, dreams, or divine messages about the boys' whereabouts. Some insisted the children were alive, trapped in a dark room. Others claimed they had been taken to the water. A few sketched crude maps with X's scrawled on them, promising the family that if they dug there, they would find the truth. Evelyn, desperate, sometimes clung to these scraps of hope, but Thomas grew furious at the intrusions. "They don't know a damn thing," he snapped, ripping one letter to pieces. But the strangest thing was how many townsfolk began to half-believe. One evening at the diner, 2 women whispered over their coffee cups about a fortune teller in the next county. They said she could find lost things, maybe even lost children. By the next day, half the town had heard the story. By the end of the week, a group of neighbors drove out to see her. They came back pale and shaken, muttering about strange details the woman couldn't have known. The Mitchells didn't go. Evelyn said her faith was in God, not in card tricks, but even she admitted, late one night to Mary, that she sometimes wondered if the psychics knew something the sheriff didn't. More disturbing than the letters and visions were the stories that grew out of the woods themselves. The clearing with the strange carvings became the heart of rumor. Teenagers dared each other to go there at night. Some swore they saw candles still burning, melted stubs arranged in circles. Others whispered of chanting deep in the trees. A hunter claimed he found animal bones there, arranged in patterns that made his skin crawl. Whispers of cults spread quickly, fueled by the times. The late 60s were full of headlines about strange groups springing up across the country, communes and sects dabbling in things decent folk didn't speak of. For a town like Maple Falls, steeped in routine and tradition, it was easy to believe something sinister had crept into the forest unnoticed. And yet, others pointed fingers closer to home. The Lawson family, who lived down the road, became the subject of speculation after Mrs. Lawson admitted she had been the last to see the boys. Some muttered that she hadn't told the whole story, that maybe she'd seen them with someone else. The Lawson children were teased at school, whispers of, "Your daddy knows what happened," trailing behind them. Old grudges resurfaced too. A quiet man named Richard Hobbs, who lived alone near the rail yard, suddenly found himself eyed with suspicion. He was strange, people said, kept to himself. Didn't smile much. "You never know about men like that," someone muttered at church. And just like that, Hobbs was branded in the town's collective imagination. The sheriff tried to calm the waters, but suspicion was easier to feed than to starve. By October, the Mitchell case was no longer just about two missing boys. It had become a mirror reflecting every fear, every doubt, every unspoken unease in Maple Falls. Inside the Mitchell home, the whispers cut deeper. Evelyn stopped answering the phone after one too many cruel calls, anonymous voices suggesting her sons were gone forever, or worse, that she herself was to blame. Thomas grew paranoid, his eyes narrowing at every question from the press, convinced people weren't looking for answers so much as entertainment. Mary, caught in the middle, began to hear the whispers at school. She tried to block them out, but they always found her, classmates whispering that her brothers had been taken by the cult, or that they'd run away because her family was too strict. Some said her father was hiding something, others said her mother was cursed. The cruelty of children, born from the fear of their parents, left Mary carrying a weight too heavy for 14-year-old shoulders. The town itself began to change. The once bustling diner grew quieter, conversations hushed. Parents kept their children inside after dark. Halloween passed that year without trick-or-treaters roaming the streets. Christmas came, but the decorations felt hollow, as if joy itself had fled with the Mitchell boys. And through it all, the forest loomed. The locals began to speak of it differently. Some refused to go hunting there anymore, muttering that the woods had turned. Others insisted it was cursed. Even those who laughed off such notions admitted there was something unsettling about how the forest had given nothing back, not a scrap of clothing, not a single clue. By winter, the whispers had become part of the fabric of Maple Falls. They were spoken in living rooms, in pews, in the quiet of the hardware store. Everyone had a theory, and none of them brought the boys home. For the Mitchells, the whispers were salt in a wound that would not close. Evelyn clung harder to her nightly candle ritual, her prayers growing longer, more desperate. Thomas withdrew into silence, the lines in his face deepening. Mary became quieter still, slipping through days like a shadow. The boys were gone. The search had failed. And Maple Falls, once a town of routine and familiarity, was now a place where every rustle in the trees, every creak of a floorboard, carried the weight of dread. No one said it aloud, not yet. But in the deepest corners of their hearts, many had begun to fear the truth. Daniel and Michael Mitchell were never coming home. Winter arrived hard that year, as if the weather itself was determined to freeze Maple Falls in place. The wind cut through the bare branches, snow piled high against fences, and the creek froze into a sheet of cloudy glass. Life in town trudged on, but for the Mitchell family, time had collapsed into a blur of false hope and exhaustion. The official search tapered off by late November. Sheriff Jenkins stood in the Mitchell living room one evening, hat clutched in his hands, and admitted what they all feared. "We'll keep following tips," he said quietly, "but the organized search has done all it can." Evelyn's face crumpled. Thomas clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles whitened. Mary, sitting on the stairwell, felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't surrender, not exactly, but it was close. Still, leads trickled in, and every single one of them led nowhere. The first major tip came from a man in the next county who claimed he'd picked up two hitchhiking boys in early August, headed west. He described them as dirty, barefoot, and about the right ages. For a moment, hope flickered through the Mitchell home, but when deputies tracked the man down and pressed him for details, the story unraveled. His descriptions shifted with each telling. The dates didn't line up. In the end, he admitted he'd been drinking the night he saw them. Another tip came from a waitress who swore the boys had come into her diner with a man she didn't recognize. She said the older boy looked scared. But when shown school photos of Daniel and Michael, her certainty wavered. Could have been them, she admitted, but I can't be sure. The sheriff drove out anyway, scouring the diner and the surrounding town, but nothing matched. Then, there were the false confessions. One man, already in jail on unrelated charges, claimed he had taken the boys. He spoke with chilling detail how he lured them, where he left them. For a week, it seemed the case had cracked wide open. Deputies dug in the locations he described, combed through barns and fields. Nothing. When pressed further, the man admitted he'd made it up for attention. Another man wrote a letter to the sheriff's office confessing to the crime, only to recant days later, claiming he'd been compelled by visions. Each false confession was another blow to the Mitchell family, dragging them through waves of grief and fury. Thomas grew so angry he nearly stormed into the jail himself, demanding to confront the man who had lied about his boys. Suspects emerged closer to home too. Richard Hobbs, the quiet man near the rail yard, became a target of suspicion. Deputies questioned him multiple times. His house was searched, his yard dug up in places where neighbors swore he might have buried something. Nothing was found. Hobbs, humiliated and furious, left town the following spring. His name, however, lingered in whispers long after. The Lawson family, too, felt the sting of suspicion. Mrs. Lawson, who had last seen the boys, was questioned again and again. Each time, her story was the same. She saw them walking, kicking a can, laughing, but doubt spread like rot. At the grocery store, she caught women watching her, whispering behind their hands. Her children were teased so mercilessly, they begged not to go to school. Even Thomas wasn't immune. Some outsiders, reporters mostly, pressed Evelyn with ugly questions. Had her husband been angry that day? Was there tension at home? Could the father himself have had something to do with it? Evelyn answered each question with icy conviction. Thomas would lay down his life for his boys. Still, the insinuations left scars. The sheriff, for his part, tried to keep the investigation steady. He chased every lead, no matter how small. He spoke to every drifter, every stranger, every man whose past looked crooked. But the truth was brutal. Every trail ended in dust. Every supposed clue disintegrated under scrutiny. The Mitchells lived in a constant cycle of hope and heartbreak. The phone would ring. Evelyn would rush to answer, her voice trembling with anticipation only for her shoulders to sag moments later as another false lead collapsed. Mary began to dread the sound of the phone, associating it with disappointment. Their home became a mausoleum of waiting. Daniel's marbles still sat in a jar by the window. Michael's drawings still hung on the fridge, curling at the corners. Evelyn couldn't bring herself to put their clothes away. Their beds remained made, untouched, as though the boys might walk through the door at any moment and climb into them. The community, once united in grief, began to fracture under the weight of frustration. Some people grew tired of the endless theories and decided it was better to say nothing at all. Others clung to their suspicions, pointing fingers behind closed doors. A few chose denial, insisting the boys had simply run away and would return when they pleased, though deep down they knew better. By spring of 1969, the case was officially declared cold. For the Mitchells, those words were unbearable. Cold meant forgotten. Cold meant abandoned. Cold meant the world had moved on without their sons. But they hadn't moved on. They couldn't. Evelyn kept setting 2 extra plates at the dinner table on birthdays. Thomas walked the woods alone, long after the search had ended, long after neighbors stopped offering to join him. Mary grew up with the silence of loss echoing in every corner of her home. The dead ends weren't just in the investigation, they were in the Mitchells' lives too. Every holiday, every empty chair, every milestone that passed without Daniel and Michael was another dead end, another reminder that the road had run out. And yet, beneath the silence, beneath the grief, the woods still waited. And in those woods, far beyond the places anyone had searched, a cabin stood untouched, holding the truth that no one in Maple Falls could yet imagine. Time is cruel when you are waiting for someone who never comes home. The seasons turned over Maple Falls, year after year, each one leaving the Mitchells further behind. The 60s ended, the 70s rolled on. The world outside their small town changed with protests and presidents and music that grew louder and stranger. But inside the Mitchell home, it was always 1968, always August, always that moment when the boys walked down the road and never returned. The first year was the hardest, though none of the years that followed were easy. Evelyn clung to hope with a fierceness that startled even those closest to her. She kept Daniel's and Michael's bedrooms exactly as they'd left them. Their beds were made, their toys in place, their shoes neatly lined by the wall. Each morning she dusted the shelves. Each evening she opened the windows to let in fresh air. She refused to let the rooms go stale. "They'll need it ready," she'd whisper, "when they come home." She lit her candle in the window every night, the flame flickering against the glass. Neighbors passing by grew used to the sight, a small and stubborn beacon against the dark. Some found it comforting. Others found it unbearable. For Evelyn, it was survival. Thomas carried his grief differently. At first, he threw himself into the search long after everyone else had stopped. He combed the woods with a flashlight and a notebook, mapping areas he'd already covered, circling places he planned to return. He grew thinner, his face hollow, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. When winter came and the snow piled thick, he trudged through it anyway, convinced he would find something everyone else had missed. By the mid-70s, his searching had slowed. Not because he believed any less, but because his body began to break under the strain. His back ached, his legs gave out more quickly. He grew quieter, retreating into long silences, his hands calloused from work at the mill. At night, he sat at the kitchen table with a beer, staring out the window as if willing the gravel road to deliver his boys back to him. Mary was forced to grow up in the shadow of her brother's absence. At 14, she had been a sister. By 16, she had become a caretaker, making meals when her mother couldn't get out of bed, paying bills when her father forgot, carrying the weight of a household that had collapsed in on itself. Her classmates didn't know what to say to her. Some offered pity that stung worse than cruelty. Others avoided her entirely, as if grief were contagious. At school dances, she stood at the edge of the gymnasium, watching other girls laugh and spin, her own heart heavy with the knowledge that her family's laughter had been stolen. She graduated quietly, without celebration. Her parents sat in the bleachers, clapping softly, their faces still clouded. For most families, graduation was a milestone. For the Mitchells, it was just another marker of time, another reminder of what was missing. The town itself shifted in subtle ways. Maple Falls carried the disappearance like a scar. For years, people lowered their voices when speaking of the Mitchells. Children were warned not to stray too far, their parents' fears woven into bedtime stories and stern reminders. "Don't go past the fields," mothers said. "Don't wander into the woods." The forest became something more than trees. It became a symbol of loss, of danger, of questions left unanswered. By the 80s, the story of Daniel and Michael had become more legend than memory to the younger generation. Kids who hadn't even been born in '68 dared each other to go into the woods at night, whispering that the boys' ghosts wandered there. Some claimed to see lantern lights flickering between the trees. Others swore they heard children's laughter carried on the wind. For the Mitchell family, there was nothing ghostly about it. Their grief was bone-deep, heavy, unrelenting. Evelyn aged under the weight of her loss. Her hair turned gray before its time, her hands knotted from years of wringing. Yet, she never stopped setting out 2 extra plates on birthdays, never stopped lighting her candle. By the late 80s, neighbors whispered about her rituals, some calling them touching, others calling them madness. But to Evelyn, it was simple. Her boys were still out there, and until she knew otherwise, she would keep waiting. Thomas withdrew further into himself. The man who had once been steady, dependable, a fixture at the mill and in town, grew distant. He worked long hours, came home, sat in silence. He rarely smiled. Some nights, after a few too many drinks, he raged at the sheriff, at the town, at God, at himself. He never raged at Evelyn, though the strain between them grew like a crack in the foundation. They were united in grief, but divided in how they carried it. She clung to hope, he clung to guilt. Mary left Maple Falls in the early '80s, moving to a nearby city for work. She needed distance, though she carried her brothers with her wherever she went. She married, had children of her own, but even then the shadow lingered. Every time her kids played outside, she felt a jolt of fear. Every time they walked to school, she watched from the window until they were out of sight. She couldn't explain it to them fully, not until they were older, but her entire motherhood was shaped by the day her brothers vanished. Back in Maple Falls, the case grew colder with each passing year. The sheriff retired, passing the unsolved file to his successor, who in turn passed it down again. Each new sheriff flipped through the pages, shook his head, and admitted there was little more to be done. The file grew thicker with false tips, thinner with hope. Every few years, the story would flare back into the public eye. An anniversary would pass, or a new lead would surface, or a television program would mention unsolved cases. Reporters would drive back into town, their cameras and microphones reopening wounds that had never healed. Evelyn always agreed to interviews, her voice steady as she pleaded once more for answers. Thomas usually refused, muttering that nothing good came from dragging it all back into the light. By the 90s, the Mitchell boys' disappearance had become part of Maple Falls' identity. Outsiders asked about it in hushed tones. Locals spoke of it with weary resignation. The forest loomed larger than ever, both a physical and symbolic reminder of the unknown. Some newcomers to town avoided it entirely, claiming they could feel the weight of sorrow in the trees. And then, as the new millennium approached, even the whispers began to fade. Time had dulled the urgency. New tragedies had claimed the headlines. Younger generations grew up hearing the story not as breaking news, but as folklore. But the Mitchells never forgot. Evelyn's candle still burned each night, even when arthritis made it hard to hold the match. Thomas still stared out the window long after the town had gone quiet. Mary still carried the absence of her brothers into every part of her adult life. 50 years is a long time to wait. But in the summer of 2018, long after Maple Falls had learned to live with its ghost story, two hikers wandered deeper into the woods than most dared go. There, tucked away in a place no one had searched, they found a cabin, weathered, decayed, half swallowed by moss and time. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust. Rusted tin cans sat in a corner. A pair of children's shoes rested beneath a broken chair, and carved into the wall, two sets of initials, D, M, and M. M. The long, cold years were about to shatter. It was a Saturday in late August of 2018, almost 50 years to the day since the Mitchell brothers vanished. The summer heat was thick, pressing down on Maple Falls like it had in 1968, though few in town remembered it quite the same way. The world had changed. The paper mill was gone. The diner had a new neon sign. The old rail yard was just rust and weeds, but the woods, those were the same. Ancient. Waiting. Two hikers, strangers passing through, decided to take a trail few locals bothered with. They weren't from Maple Falls, so they hadn't grown up with the warnings. They hadn't absorbed the fear woven into bedtime stories about the forest. To them, it was just another green patch on a map, another place to test their boots and take photos of moss-covered trees. The path they followed wasn't much of a path at all. Deer trails tangled with roots. Branches clawed at their arms as they pushed deeper. The sounds of the town faded until all that remained was the constant hum of insects and the occasional caw of a crow overhead. By mid-afternoon, they stumbled into a clearing they hadn't expected, and there it was, the cabin. At first, they thought it was just another hunter's shack, long abandoned. The roof sagged inward, shingles missing. Moss covered the wood in thick sheets, the color of old velvet. A tree had fallen across one side, leaning against the structure like a hand pressing down. The air smelled of rot and damp earth. But there was something strange about the place, something that made both hikers pause at the edge of the clearing. The cabin didn't feel like it had been built for comfort or even shelter. It felt hidden, tucked away, as though someone had wanted it not to be found. They pushed the door open, and it groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight that cut through the broken roof. Cobwebs laced the corners, thick as curtains. But what drew their attention immediately were the objects left behind. In the corner, stacked neatly, were rusted tin cans. The labels had faded long ago, but the shape was unmistakable: beans, maybe soup, stored carefully as though someone had meant to survive here. Nearby, A pair of small shoes rested beneath a broken chair. The leather was cracked, stiff with age, but the size was chilling. Too small to belong to a man. Too small even for a teenager. These were children's shoes. And then, carved into the wooden wall, the initials. D, M, and M, M. The hikers froze. They didn't know the history of Maple Falls in detail, but something about those initials and those shoes tugged at them. They took photos. They whispered to each other that maybe this was important, maybe someone should know. By the time they hiked back into town, the sun was sinking and their nerves were raw. They walked into the local sheriff's office with dirt still on their boots, their voices shaky. By nightfall, the cabin was no longer just a secret between two hikers. It was an investigation site. The news spread like wildfire. Maple Falls, quiet for decades, buzzed again with urgency. People gathered in the diner, in church halls, on front porches, repeating the same words. They found something. In the woods. A cabin. For those who had lived through 1968, the shock was visceral. Evelyn Mitchell, now in her 80s, sat in her living room with trembling hands as her daughter Mary read the news aloud. Evelyn had never stopped believing her boys were out there somewhere, but to hear of a cabin, to hear of shoes, to hear of initials that was more than belief, that was proof. The sheriff at the time, a man named Russell Ward, drove out to the site with deputies, tape, and cameras. They treated it like a crime scene, though the crime was half a century old. The cabin creaked as investigators moved through it, their flashlights cutting across the walls. They photographed every carving, every object, every shadow. The shoes were collected carefully, bagged and labeled. The tins, too, though rusted, were marked for testing. The initials carved into the wall were measured, photographed, and analyzed. Outside, deputies marked the perimeter, their boots sinking into the soft earth. Some muttered under their breath about the cabin's eerie feeling. One deputy swore he heard something move in the woods just beyond the tape, though when he turned his light, there was nothing there. News crews arrived by the next morning. Helicopters hovered above, cameras zooming in on the clearing. The cabin became the focal point of every headline. 50 years later, clues found in Maple Falls case. The story that had haunted the town for half a century was back in the national spotlight. For Mary, now in her 60s, it was a strange mix of hope and dread. She had built a life outside Maple Falls, raised children of her own, but the shadow of her brother's disappearance had never left her. When she stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the cabin, she felt like a child again. The air smelled the same as it had in '68, damp, earthy, alive with insects. The trees whispered the same way, and for a moment, she thought she could hear Daniel and Michael's laughter on the breeze. Evelyn, too frail to make the trip, asked her daughter to describe everything. "Tell me about the shoes," she whispered over the phone. "Tell me if they're the right size." Mary's voice broke as she answered, "They are, Mama. They're just the right size." The cabin reopened wounds the town had tried to scar over. People who had avoided speaking of the case for decades now remembered details with startling clarity. Old men at the diner swore they recalled strange noises in the woods back then. Women admitted they'd seen smoke from a fire deeper in the forest but thought little of it. A few confessed they'd always believed the boys had been hidden out there somewhere. The sheriff urged caution. "We don't know what we're looking at yet," he told reporters. "We can't jump to conclusions." But inside, he knew this was big. Bigger than anything Maple Falls had seen in 50 years. Forensic teams arrived, combing the cabin inch by inch. They scraped samples from the walls. They dug shallow pits in the dirt floor. They searched the surrounding woods for disturbed earth, for signs of graves, for anything that might connect the cabin to the missing boys. And slowly, a picture began to form. The cabin wasn't just a random shack. It had been lived in. The arrangement of the tins, the worn grooves on the chair legs, the carvings on the walls, it all pointed to someone spending serious time there. Someone who had wanted to remain hidden. Someone who had brought children with them. The initials were the most damning. Too exact, too precise. D, M, and M, M. Not random scratches, not coincidence. The town buzzed with questions. Who had built the cabin? Who had used it? Why had it never been found in the original search? And most haunting of all, had Daniel and Michael been there, alive, after the town had already given up? For the Mitchell family, the discovery was both hope and horror. Proof that their boys had been there meant they hadn't simply vanished, but it also meant they had been close all along, so close the town had missed them. The cabin had waited 50 years to speak, and now that it had, Maple Falls was forced to listen. The cabin's discovery changed everything. For the first time in half a century, there was physical evidence, not rumors, not whispers, not false confessions, but objects you could touch, wood you could scrape, shoes you could hold in trembling hands. Sheriff Russell Ward treated the case like it had happened yesterday. He reopened the Mitchell file, blew dust off the old folders, and spread photographs across his desk. Images of Daniel and Michael, smiling with gap-toothed grins, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, reports written in fading ink, all of it was back on the table. The forensics team began their work. The shoes were tested, their leather brittle, their stitching frayed. But under the cracks they found remnants of fibers consistent with manufacturing from the late 60s. The size matched perfectly with boys of 10 and 8. Inside the soles, traces of DNA clung degraded, fragile, but enough to suggest they had been worn by children. The tins were harder to analyze. Their labels were long gone, but rust patterns suggested they had been stacked carefully, not discarded. Someone had been deliberate, someone had rationed. But the most haunting discovery came from the walls. Underneath the initials, investigators found faint scratches, overlapping marks. They weren't just initials. They were tally marks, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, etched in uneven rows, some short, some long, the kind of thing a child might carve to mark days. When the photographs of those marks were shown to Mary, her breath caught. "That's Daniel," she whispered. "That's exactly the kind of thing he'd do." The realization was a gut punch. The boys had been alive in that cabin, alive long enough to carve days into the wood, which meant someone had kept them there. The question now was, who? Sheriff Ward turned to property records. The cabin, though forgotten, was on land that had once been privately owned. Digging into old county files, he found that in the late 60s, the land had belonged to a man named Walter Griggs. The name struck a chord with some of the older residents. Griggs had lived on the outskirts of town, a reclusive figure who rarely came into Maple Falls. He had a reputation for being odd, muttering to himself, building traps in the woods, avoiding neighbors. Some said he'd served in the Korean War and had never come back the same. Others claimed he dabbled in darker things. What everyone agreed on was this: Griggs had vanished in the early 70s, his property abandoned. Had anyone checked his land during the original search? Sheriff Jenkins, long since deceased, had noted in his logs that deputies had spoken to Griggs. He had insisted he hadn't seen the boys. His property was walked briefly, but the cabin tucked so far into the woods had gone unnoticed. Now, 50 years later, the oversight was glaring. Sheriff Ward tracked down what remained of Griggs's family. A niece living 2 states away remembered visiting his home once as a child. She described him as strange, always watching, always writing things in little notebooks. She hadn't heard from him since the 70s. Rumors surfaced quickly. Old men at the diner recalled Griggs building hidden shacks in the woods. Hunters swore they'd stumbled on his traps, crude, dangerous contraptions meant to catch more than animals. Some even remembered hearing children's laughter near his property after the boys had disappeared, though they had dismissed it as echoes or imagination. Investigators pieced together a chilling picture. Griggs had the means, the location, and the isolation to take the Mitchell boys and keep them hidden. The tally marks suggested captivity. The shoes confirmed the presence of children. The initials tied it directly to Daniel and Michael. The only missing piece was Griggs himself. But digging deeper, Sheriff Ward found a thin, fragile lead. In 1974, a body had been discovered in a neighboring county, decomposed beyond recognition. The cause of death was listed as exposure, but the man had no ID, buried as a John Doe. Dental records, compared with Griggs's old army files, confirmed the match. Walter Griggs had died alone in the woods, only a few years after the Mitchell boys had vanished. He had taken the truth with him. Still, the evidence painted a clear enough picture. For the first time in 50 years, the Mitchell family had a name. They had someone to blame, someone to curse, someone to hold responsible, even if justice would never reach him. When Mary heard the news, she wept. Not because it brought comfort, but because it solidified the unthinkable. Her brothers had been alive after the town gave up. Alive, hidden in a cabin so close, marking days into wood while the world searched everywhere else. Evelyn, frail and fading, listened quietly as her daughter explained. She closed her eyes, her hands clasped tight. "They were so close," she whispered. "So close, and we never found them." The cabin had given answers, but those answers were cruel. The town of Maple Falls reeled. Some felt guilt, realizing the oversight of the original search. Others felt vindicated, certain they had always suspected Griggs. A few clung to denial, insisting the evidence was circumstantial. But the initials on the wall, the tally marks, the shoes, they were undeniable. The boys had been there, and then they were gone. The reopening of the case brought national attention once more. News anchors retold the story with grave voices. Documentaries began circling. For the Mitchells, it was both a blessing and a curse. Their sons were remembered, yes, but their suffering was dissected for strangers' consumption. Still, the truth was finally visible. And now, the Mitchell family had to face it head-on. The truth, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like truth at all. It felt like salt poured into an old wound. Walter Griggs. The name settled over Maple Falls like a shadow. For decades, he had been a rumor, a recluse on the fringes of town, someone most people avoided and few truly knew. Now, he was the villain in the story that had haunted the Mitchell family for half a century. The evidence was enough to paint the picture. The cabin, the tally marks, the shoes, the initials carved into the wall. And Griggs himself dead since 1974, his bones resting in an unmarked grave, the secrets buried with him. There would never be a trial. No confessions. No chance for Thomas to look him in the eye and demand answers. No chance for Evelyn to ask why. The past had closed itself off, leaving only fragments behind. But still, for the first time in 50 years, the Mitchells had something. They had a name. They had a place. They had a story to hold on to, however dark it was. Mary sat at her mother's kitchen table when the sheriff delivered the news. Evelyn, now a frail woman whose hands trembled when she held her teacup, listened in silence. Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, her lips moving in a whisper Mary couldn't hear. Later, when asked what she had said, Evelyn explained, "I told my boys I was sorry. Sorry we didn't find them sooner. Sorry we let them down." Mary carried the weight differently. She felt fury that her brothers had been so close all along. Fury that their childhood had ended in a cabin while she grew old without them. But mingled with the rage was something she hadn't felt in decades. Relief. Relief that they hadn't simply vanished into nothingness. Relief that the void now had shape. The town reacted with a mix of shame and morbid fascination. Old-timers remembered how deputies had spoken to Griggs in those first days, how his land had been brushed past. The oversight haunted them. Younger folks, who had grown up with the story as folklore, now stood in the diner or the grocery store, whispering about the man who had lived among them like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Reporters descended once again, their cameras and questions reopening the wounds. Some townsfolk resented the attention, others leaned into it, spinning theories for the microphones. The cabin became infamous, a symbol of Maple Falls' darkest chapter. The Mitchells, though, withdrew. For them, the discovery was not a story to be shared, but a final chapter in a book they had never wanted to read. Evelyn passed quietly that winter, her candle still burning in the window on the night she died. Mary lit it one last time before snuffing it out, tears streaking her face. "She waited her whole life," she whispered. "Now she can rest." Thomas had died years earlier, never knowing the truth. Mary took some comfort in believing he knew it now, wherever he was. The cabin was torn down the following spring. The sheriff argued it was unsafe, that leaving it standing would only invite trespassers. But before it was destroyed, investigators made one final sweep. They collected every scrap of wood, every nail, every carving. They cataloged it all for the record. And that was when they found something that had been overlooked. Behind one of the wall planks, hidden where the wood had split, was a folded scrap of paper, yellowed with age, fragile to the touch. On it, written in a child's shaky hand, were 4 words: "We were not alone." The handwriting matched Daniel's, confirmed by samples from his old school assignments. The words were haunting, cryptic, impossible to fully interpret. Did it mean Griggs had accomplices? Did it mean there were other children in the cabin at some point? Or was it simply the fevered imagination of a boy trapped in the woods, carving hope or terror into paper the way he carved tally marks into wood? No one could say for certain. But the note lingered in the files, a final chilling mystery that even the cabin couldn't surrender. For Mary, it was both a comfort and a curse. Comfort, because it was proof her brother had left behind a voice, proof he had been alive, proof his story wasn't erased. A curse, because those words raised questions that might never be answered. The story of the Mitchell brothers ended with the cabin, with Walter Griggs, with the discovery that had come too late. But the echo of those words, "We were not alone," ensured that Maple Falls would never truly rest. Some nights, hikers say they still hear children's laughter in the woods. Others claim they see a flicker of light, like a candle in a window, deep among the trees. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's guilt woven into the fabric of the town. Or maybe, just maybe, the woods are still holding secrets. What we know is this: two brothers walked down a gravel road in August of 1968 and never came home. 50 years later, a cabin told part of their story, enough to bring closure. Enough to bring tears, enough to leave behind one last mystery. And to this day, in Maple Falls, people still whisper about the boys who vanished, the cabin that waited, and the note that read, "We were not alone."